So like most Americans, I'm currently stuck at home right now. Normally I travel for work, flying across the country. I work in hospitals in multiple states, taking care of inpatients. But at the moment, it's not safe to fly, so I'm stuck at home here. My wife works as an emergency room doctor, and fortunately she's been safe so far. The hope is that keeps up. And we're quarantining from ourselves at home here too, so I'm all by myself and trying to find some way to be productive here. Boy, it's been like a month. So I thought it would be helpful to talk a little bit about some of the information I've picked up along the way about nutrition. This is something that surprisingly isn't really emphasized that much in medical school. There's no doctor who is formally trained as a specialist in nutrition, so to speak. What I mean by that is that when people go to medical school and then do their training afterwards in something called a residency program, which is where you are a doctor, but you're learning how to effectively take care of patients, there's no residency program where you learn nutrition in a dedicated, focused way. Now, that being said, I've been interested in this since I was a teenager and paying close attention to really any aspects of nutrition along the way so that I could build a good foundation of knowledge and understanding about how the processes work underlying nutrition to kind of put it all together and make it something useful and practical. So that's something that I want to try to share with all of you today. And so for the first part of this, I wanted to talk about carbohydrates. And there's a lot to say, but first off, it's important to get on the same page about what we're talking about with what is a carb or a carbohydrate, because it seems like there's sometimes a lot of confusion about what that really means. I mean, you hear all sorts of things like carbs are bad, don't eat carbs. And there's some truth to that, in the sense that it's pretty easy to eat carbohydrates in an unhealthy way. But we'll talk more about that in multiple videos, and now's our chance to talk about, well, what are we really talking about in the first place? So the name is sort of helpful. It literally means hydrated carbon, carbohydrate. Basically, that's as though you stuck a bunch of water molecules onto carbon. And so the simplest carbohydrate, and really the most common one, is called glucose. You might have heard of your blood glucose before. If you look at the molecule itself, you'll see that there are 6 carbon atoms, these black ones, and they're all connected together in this 6-sided ring structure, kind of a hexagonal form, or what's called a hexose sugar, with that root of 6-sided hex. And if you look at that, you see that pretty much all these carbons have stuck on them this oxygen and hydrogen group. If you remember, water molecules are H2O, so 2 hydrogens and an oxygen. And this is basically what it looks like when a water molecule gets stuck onto the carbon backbone here. Now, one of the most important lessons in organic chemistry and biochemistry is that the shape and organization and location of atoms as part of a molecule is really, really important. It completely dictates the behavior of something. And so when you look at the glucose molecule, you might notice, if you look carefully, that all of the water groups are located kind of around the circumference of the molecule. So rather than being at the very tops and bottoms of the molecule, they're kind of located around the waistband, so to speak. That's really important because if we change the location of some of these water molecule groups, then it actually becomes a different molecule. So whereas glucose is probably the most common sugar molecule, with these water groups located in these locations, if you change the location of the water on carbon number 4, so instead of being in this sort of equatorial position, it's called, or kind of around the center or waistline, if instead you took that and moved it to that position at the top, that's actually now called galactose, which is another one of these simple sugars, also called monosaccharides, that's very important in nutrition. The third most important single sugar, or monosaccharide, literally meaning one sugar, is called fructose. And this is it looks pretty different. It's based on the same stuff. So if you look at the structure of it, it looks very different qualitatively, but it still has 6 carbons, and they're still hydrated in the same way as they were in the glucose molecule. The big difference here is that instead of carbon number 1 being attached to that oxygen in the ring, now it's carbon number 2. So that ends up making a little bit of a tighter ring, so you can see it's kind of a pentagon, or with 5 points to it. But otherwise, it's a fairly similar sort of molecule. It just ends up looking a lot different, and to be fair, it's handled fairly differently because of that change in structure. Now, these 3 single sugar molecules, glucose, fructose, and galactose, these monosaccharides, are basically the simplest form of carbohydrates that you can have. So these are really the building blocks of more complex carbohydrates. And the next layer up is naturally, instead of having 1 sugar molecule, you can have 2 sugar molecules. So all of the ones that are most relevant for nutrition, they start with a glucose, and then they add one of the other ones to it. The first and most important disaccharide, or 2 sugar molecule to talk about, is called sucrose. So this is what happens if you take a glucose and you add a fructose to it. And this is really important because this is the form that most sugar that we eat is in. So if you go to the store and you buy a bag of table sugar, really it's talking about sucrose. So half of that is glucose, half of that is fructose joined together. There's really a lot to say about that, as I think everybody is aware. Increased intake of added sugar is a huge health problem. Contributes to obesity and diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol. It's something that there's a lot to say about why it's such a problem. But I think it's pretty clear that it is a big problem, and cutting down on added sugar, or in most cases we're talking about added sucrose, or things that are a lot like sucrose, is one of the best things that you can do in your diet. You can also stick a glucose and a galactose molecule together. So that disaccharide with glucose and galactose is called lactose. And so you've probably heard of that in milk products. And that's really the main source in our diets where we find this. And lactose is best known by the fact that there's a lot of people in the world that don't really metabolize it too well. So normally, physiologically, in most people around the world, the enzyme that breaks down lactose is present pretty abundantly around the time of your birth, because we're designed to live off of milk for at least the first few months of life. And so the enzyme present to break that down is abundant early on. But normally, as we get weaned off a milk-based diet and start eating solid foods, the expression of that enzyme can decrease. And that's the case in most people. If you look around the world, maybe about 70% on average of people are not necessarily completely deficient in the enzyme called lactase, which breaks down lactose. But there's some degree of deficiency, and lactose intolerance, as I'm sure a lot of people are aware, can cause a bunch of gastrointestinal or abdominal related symptoms like gas and bloating and cramps and pain, flatulence or farting, and things like that. So this is something that a lot of people have practical experience with, but this is really what we're talking about when somebody says they're lactose intolerant, meaning they have trouble breaking down the combination of glucose and galactose. They have trouble splitting the bond between those two things. So then we get to the combination of glucose with another glucose molecule. So this is the disaccharide made with 2 glucose molecules. This is called maltose. And it got its name because it was originally found in malt. So if you take grains and leave them in water over time, products in the grain start to break down into maltose. And then that naturally begs the question of, well, why would you make maltose by leaving grains in water? That's because maltose is really the building block of more complex carbohydrates. So if you keep putting together more and more glucose molecules, you start to make complex carbohydrates. And this is a category that has kind of two subheadings, which include starches and fibers collectively. So when you start talking about starches, there's really two main things that we're talking about. One is called amylose, and one is called amylopectin. And honestly, you don't really need to worry about the names so much. The idea is that if you keep stringing together glucose molecules into literally hundreds of them, or in the case of amylopectin, even thousands of them, then you start to get these very long, complex molecules that are just made up of glucose. And so the main difference between them is that amylose is just a single chain of glucose molecules. They're all bound together in the same way. Carbon number 1 of one molecule is stuck to carbon number 4 of the molecule after it, and on it goes, and you get a chain of several hundred glucose molecules. When we're talking about amylopectin, it's a much bigger thing overall, and it's sort of like a bunch of chains of amylose that are all stuck together. So the idea is that you still have those single chains of glucose that are potentially a few hundred molecules long, where carbon number 1 of one molecule is stuck to carbon number 4 of the next one. But every 24 to 30 glucose molecules, you have another bond, where in this case, carbon number 6 of one molecule is bound to carbon number 1 of a different one. And what that ends up doing is then you get these branching patterns. So you have all these kind of linear chains, but then there's little points where it branches out and becomes this much more complex branching molecule. So it's much larger and less tightly packed. And so that can have effects on the properties of the molecule that we can talk about in more detail at some other time. Now, what's interesting about this broad category of complex carbohydrates, or what we would chemically call them as polysaccharides, meaning many sugars, is that this really includes basically everything that you think of as fiber as well. And talking about fiber in detail really takes a whole video at least, but suffice to say, fibers are really close to starch. Probably the most common fiber out there is called cellulose. And what's interesting about cellulose, that this is incidentally the same stuff that makes up actually a large percentage of wood. It makes up basically all of cotton, but it's sort of a tough supportive structure. So like the stalks and stems of plants and grasses, things like that. But cellulose is also a chain of glucose molecules. There's nothing different about that fundamental backbone or structure. The only difference is the way the glucose molecules are bonded together. So the quickest way to say this is that the bond is still between the same carbon atoms of the glucose molecules, so carbon number 1 and carbon number 4. The only difference is the direction in which that bond comes off of carbon number 1. And so if you think back to when I was talking about the location of the water molecules along that carbon backbone, where they can kind of be around the waistline or in the, quote, equatorial position, kind of along the equator of the molecule, so to speak, or they can be on the tops or bottoms of the molecule. That's called the axial positions. The same thing is true about the position in which the bond comes off of the carbon molecule to link to the next carbon molecule. When it comes off of the bottom position or top position, depending on the conformation it's called in the molecule, that's called an alpha bond. alpha glycosidic bond. And when it comes off that kind of horizontal or equatorial position, that's called a beta bond or beta glycosidic bond. And this tiny little difference is enough that we can readily metabolize, process, break down starches like amylose and amylopectin that have that alpha 1,4 glycosidic bond, which is the full term for it. And we cannot break down, we can't even approach that beta 1,4 glycosidic bond that's present in cellulose. Now, if you're talking about a termite, they have no problem with it. That's why they eat your house. They break down the wood, they turn it into sugar, no problem. And we just can't do that. Maybe sometimes some of the bacteria in our gut possibly can make some headway on certain things that our normal digestive system can't. But generally speaking, that's what makes fiber fiber. It's usually glucose chains or slight modifications of glucose chains that we just can't break down. And so they pass through undigested, they add bulk to the stool, they can bind up other things. There's a lot of reasons why fiber is very helpful that we can talk in detail about later on. But that's really the main difference between starches and fibers. So now, to summarize, the main things that you really need to know if you're going to talk about carbohydrates is that they're all fundamentally based on what are called monosaccharides. Usually we're talking about glucose, fructose, and galactose. Glucose and fructose are honestly the most important. You can start putting these together into disaccharides. The most common ones being sucrose, made of glucose and fructose, that's table sugar. Lactose, which is glucose and galactose, mostly in milk-based products. And maltose, which honestly in and of itself is not present in a lot of foods, but is important because if you put a bunch of glucose together, in the process of making maltose and beyond, that's what turns into starches. So amylose and amylopectin basically just being large chains of glucose molecules that may or may not have branches to them. So amylopectin has many branches and is a very, very big molecule with lots and lots and lots, hundreds and hundreds or thousands of glucose molecules all branching away. And amylose is still very big, hundreds of glucose molecules, but there's no branching to it. And then fiber, which is still based on chains of glucose, they're just connected in such a way that our body can't break them down. And that's the only reason they're called fiber and not starch, just whether or not we can metabolize them. Alright, if you liked the video, please consider hitting the like button. If you want to receive more information like this, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell notification so you'll be notified whenever new videos are available. And please leave me any comments that you have. I always want to do a better job on these things, so if you have questions, comments, things you liked, didn't like, things you want to hear about, please let me know. Alright, so until the next one, take care of yourselves. I'll see you later, and bye.